Whose child is this?
Those words were the beginning of the end, the question that shattered the fragile peace we had built, exposing the dark secrets that had festered in our home for years. The question hung in the air like a curse, heavy and suffocating, trapping me in a moment that felt both endless and terrifying. My husband's voice trembled with a mixture of fear, confusion, and cold realization that sent chills down my spine. I remember the way he looked at me, his eyes filled with a mixture of fear, confusion, and something else, something that chilled me to the bone. He stood there, holding our son in his trembling arms, his eyes boring into mine, demanding an answer I couldn't give. For 10 years, we had fought for this, prayed, hoped, and sacrificed everything for the chance to bring a child into our lives. We endured the torment of our families, the whispers and stares of our neighbors, the unbearable silence of an empty home. In our culture, childlessness is more than a burden. It is a curse, a mark of shame that stains not just the woman but her entire family. My husband's relatives never missed an opportunity to remind me of that. They called me barren, cursed, a failure of a woman who couldn't fulfill her most basic purpose. They pushed my husband to send me away, to remarry and find a real woman who could give him children. But he refused. He loved me, stood by me, even as his family's hatred grew more intense. For that, I loved him even more. Yet there was a secret that lay between us, a truth that only he and I knew. The real reason for our childlessness was because my husband and I both had medical conditions that affected our ability to have children. We had gone to see my husband's best friend and confidant, who was also a medical doctor, for a checkup, desperate to find out why we couldn't conceive. The diagnosis was devastating. His sperm was incapable of fertilization, and I had a condition with my womb that did not allow conception. The doctors offered no hope, no solution, just the cold reality that we would never have children of our own. He didn't tell anyone, not even his family. He bore the shame alone, protecting me from their wrath. But the weight of that burden began to crack the foundation of our marriage. I cried every day over this condition, but I wouldn't give up. I desperately wanted a child. We tried everything, prayer houses, herbal remedies, modern medicine, but nothing worked. With each failure, the desperation in his eyes grew, mirroring the emptiness I felt inside. The love that once burned so brightly between us began to dim under the strain. He started to pull away, spending more time at work, leaving me alone in the house that had become a prison of silence and grief. It was in that silence that the darkness found me. I decided to seek other unconventional means to have a child. I don't know when the idea first took root, but once it did, it consumed me. Before now, I had heard whispers, stories of women who, in their desperation, turned to the other side. These women had issues with childlessness, and they sought help from the spiritual realms that no human soul should have contact with. They spoke of dark entities, spirits from the dark world who could grant your deepest desires, but at a price. To grant your deepest desire for a child, one of the prices to be paid is to surrender yourself to their human agents in ways I cannot describe, while the others performed horrific fertility rituals on your behalf. They claimed this is how these dark fertility spirits could possess one's body and make it ready for conception. At first, I dismissed it as superstition, something that belonged to the realm of old wives' tales. But as the years passed and my desperation grew, so did my willingness to believe and try this means for a solution. It wasn't an easy decision, but I was desperate. I sought out a woman, an old crone who lived at the edge of the village, shunned by others for her dealings with the dark arts. She was an expert in performing fertility rituals. She was feared, but I was too desperate to care. When I came to her, she looked at me with eyes that seemed to see right through me, right into the depths of my soul. She knew why I had come, and she didn't hesitate. What she asked of me was horrible and unthinkable. I told myself it was the only way, that it would be worth it in the end. So I made a deal that would change our lives forever. The rituals were strange, terrifying even, but I followed her instructions without question. I surrendered myself to her human male agent. He was covered with dirty rags of clothing and ornaments. His eyes were red, and his breath was like the stench of a rotten egg. There was nothing comely about him, but I had to do as I was instructed, surrender to him. The things I saw, the things I did, I can't bring myself to speak of them. But when it was done, she told me my womb and fertility problems had been healed and that I would conceive. I asked her what about my husband's condition. She said the rituals had suspended that, and I should not worry. Everything had been taken care of. She was right. A month later, I found out I was pregnant. I was overjoyed. For the first time in years, there was hope. My husband was ecstatic, convinced that our prayers had finally been answered. He believed it was a miracle, a sign from God, like all our prayers had finally been answered, that our faith had been rewarded. But I knew better. I knew what I had done, what I had brought into our lives. When our son was born, he was beautiful. Too beautiful, almost ethereal. My husband couldn't stop smiling. He held the baby in his arms, tears of joy streaming down his face. He was so happy, so full of hope. He doted on him, lavishing him with love and attention. For a while, we were happy. The house that had once been filled with silence was now alive with the sounds of laughter, of a baby's cries, of a family finally complete. But the shadow of what I had done lingered, and it wasn't long before it began to make itself known. It started with small things, shadows that seemed to move on their own, whispers in the night that had no source. At first, I told myself it was just my imagination, a consequence of the guilt I carried. But as our son grew, the strangeness became harder to ignore. There were nights when I would wake to find him staring at me with those cold, unblinking eyes, eyes that seemed far too knowing for a child so young. The air in the house felt thick, oppressive, as if something unseen was watching us, waiting. My husband noticed the change too, though he refused to acknowledge it. He was so happy, so full of joy. He even went to see his doctor, his best friend, eager to share the good news. But when he returned home that night, his joy had turned to confusion, as though he was hit with bad news he couldn't fathom. He spent more and more time away from home, leaving me alone with our son. When he did come home, the joy he once showed for our child had begun to fade, replaced by a growing unease. The love that had once bound us together was slowly being eroded by a fear neither of us dared to speak of. About a week later, he said he was going to see his friend, the doctor. I asked why, but he answered coldly, saying, "Nothing." I probed further, worried that he might be sick or have a medical condition, but he answered with a withdrawn and evasive voice, saying, "He wants my advice about something, and I agreed to meet up with him today." He left home, leaving me further confused and deeply worried. After returning from the doctor, my husband confronted me. His voice was trembling, his face pale with disbelief. "I still have the condition, and I'm sure you still have yours," he said, barely able to get the words out. "The doctor ran more tests on me. Nothing has changed, so whose child is this?" I stood there, frozen, my mind racing for an explanation, but there was none. The truth was there, hanging between us like a noose, tightening with every second of silence. He looked at me, his eyes pleading for a lie, something to make sense of the nightmare we had found ourselves in. But I couldn't give it to him. The darkness had already taken root, and it was too late to turn back. The days that followed were a blur of fear and suspicion. I tried to reassure him, to convince him that our son was indeed his, that the tests must have been wrong. But he wasn't convinced. He grew distant, cold, barely speaking to me, and the love we had once shared began to wither even further. He would spend hours away from home, leaving me alone with the child that was now a constant reminder of my sins. The atmosphere in the house grew darker, more oppressive, as if the walls themselves were closing in on us. It wasn't long before the tension reached a breaking point. One night, after a particularly heated argument, my husband snapped. He stormed into our son's room, his face twisted with rage and fear. "This is not my child," he screamed, shaking the crib with such force that I thought it would break. He looked at me, his eyes wild with desperation. "What did you do? What did you bring into this house?" His voice was barely a whisper, choked with tears. "What have you done?" I fell to my knees, tears streaming down my face, as the weight of my actions finally crushed me. I wanted to tell him the truth, to confess everything, but the words caught in my throat. I couldn't do it. I couldn't bear to see the look of betrayal in his eyes, but he knew. He knew without me saying a word. Like a man possessed with legions of devils, he grabbed our son from his crib, holding him at arm's length as if he were some kind of monster. I tried to calm him down, but he was beyond reason. The darkness in the house seemed to thicken, pressing down on us, suffocating us. Our son began to cry, a high-pitched wail that sent a shiver down my spine. My husband's face twisted in rage, and he raised his hand as if to strike the child. But then, something unimaginable happened. Our son, who was barely a year old, stopped crying. He turned his gaze on his father, and in that moment the room grew cold, unnaturally cold. The shadows that had been lurking in the corners of the room seemed to stretch, to grow, until they were enveloping us. My husband froze as he realized that he was no longer in control, his body stiffening as if gripped by an invisible force. His eyes widened in terror as the life drained out of him. He dropped our son, who landed softly on the bed, unharmed. But my husband collapsed to the floor and began to convulse, his body seizing up as if gripped by an invisible force. His eyes rolled back into his head, and he let out a strangled gasp. I watched, helpless, as life was draining out of him, almost lifeless. I wanted to scream, to run, but I was frozen in place, unable to move, unable to look away from the horror that was unfolding before me. From nowhere, I felt a sudden surge of resistant currents and energy bursting through me, and I shouted, "No, no, no, you can't take my husband!" And then, just as suddenly as it had begun, it was over. The room returned to normal, the shadows retreating back to their corners. Our son lay on the bed, staring up at me with those cold, knowing eyes. I knew then, with a certainty that chilled me to the bone, that he had done this. The darkness I had brought into our home had taken a hold of my husband, made him its own, and now there was no turning back. The silence that followed was worse than any scream. It was the sound of everything we had built crumbling to dust. My husband was restored to normalcy. He immediately picked himself up from the floor and dashed out of the room like a madman. He left that night, walking out into the darkness without a word, leaving me alone with the child I had brought into this world, a child that was not his. The next day, he was found dead in a car crash. They said it was an accident, that he must have lost control of the car. But I knew better. I knew it was the darkness that had taken him, the darkness that I had invited into our lives. The weight of what I had done was unbearable. I had lost everything, my husband, my family, my soul. The child, this creature, this thing that I had brought into the world was all I had left. But it was not a child. It was a monster, a demon in the guise of an innocent boy. When my husband died, it was as if the light in my life was extinguished. The man I had loved, the father of my child, was gone, and with him all the joy, all the warmth, all the meaning of life. I was left alone in the darkness, my heart a hollow shell, my soul a barren wasteland. I buried my husband, telling no one what led to his death. But the truth weighed on me, a constant, crushing presence that I could never escape. The house, once a place of hope and joy, had become a prison, filled with the darkness I had unleashed. And my son, my beautiful, terrifying son, grew stranger with each passing day. He spoke little, but his actions were enough to fill me with dread. He would sit for hours, staring at the shadows as if conversing with something only he could see. When others came to visit, he would watch them with those cold, unblinking eyes, and I could see the fear in their faces. They didn't know what I had done, but they could sense that something was terribly wrong. He was all I had left, all I had to live for. I clung to the hope that I could somehow change him by showering him with much love and find some semblance of joy again, some reason to keep going. But nothing seemed to work. He grew worse, but I was desperate. I needed to believe that he was my salvation, my reason to keep going, my light in the darkness. So I decided to ignore the signs. I ignored the way he would watch me with those cold, unblinking eyes, the way he never smiled, never laughed. I told myself it was just my grief, just my imagination. I couldn't bear to believe anything else. But it was not a child. It was a monster, a demon in the guise of an innocent boy. As the months passed by, certain strange incidents started occurring. The incidents started small, almost imperceptible. Objects moved from where I had left them, strange noises in the dead of night. a cold breeze that seemed to come from nowhere. I tried to ignore them, to convince myself that it was just my imagination. But deep down, I knew that the darkness was growing, that the thing I had brought into this world was becoming more powerful. One night, I woke to find our son standing at the foot of my bed, staring at me with those cold, emotionless eyes. He didn't say a word, but I could feel the malevolence radiating from him, the darkness that had taken root in his soul. I wanted to reach out to him, to comfort him, but I was too afraid. I knew that whatever he had become was beyond my reach, beyond anyone's reach. It wasn't long before others began to notice. Accidents started happening around the house, strange, inexplicable accidents that left people injured or worse. My in-laws, who had once tormented me, now kept their distance, terrified of the thing that had come into our lives. They whispered among themselves, but this time their words were filled with fear rather than malice. The final straw came when one of my husband's relatives, a particularly cruel woman who had always been vocal about her disdain for me, came to visit. She had never liked me, and she had made it her mission to make my life miserable. But as she stood in our living room, ranting about how I had ruined the family, our son walked into the room. He looked at her with those cold, unblinking eyes, and she suddenly went silent. A few moments later, she began to scream. It was a sound of pure terror, a sound that I will never forget. She clutched her chest, her face contorted in pain, and collapsed to the floor, dead before she hit the ground. The coroner later said it was a heart attack, but I knew the truth. I knew that the darkness had claimed another victim. After that, no one dared to come near us. My in-laws knew what I had done, even if they didn't fully understand it. They knew that I had brought something dark, something evil into our world. They could see the darkness that surrounded us, and they wanted no part of it. I was alone, more alone than I had ever been, trapped in a nightmare of my own making. We were pariahs, shunned by everyone we had once known. The house became a tomb, filled with the echoes of the past and the darkness that now ruled our lives. I was a prisoner, trapped in the nightmare I had created, unable to escape, unable to do anything but watch as the darkness continued to grow. As the days turned to weeks, it grew more apparent. The things it did, the things it said, no human child could do those things, could say those things. It was cruel, twisted, taking pleasure in my suffering, in the destruction of everything I held dear. And yet I couldn't bring myself to do what needed to be done. I couldn't destroy it. I couldn't rid myself of the thing I had brought into this world. It would be the end of me. The years passed in a blur of fear and despair. Our son grew into a man, but the darkness inside him only became more pronounced. He rarely spoke, rarely showed any emotion, but his presence was suffocating, a constant reminder of the evil I had brought into the world. The house, once filled with light and hope, was now a place of shadows, a place where the darkness reigned supreme. I tried to leave once, to escape the nightmare that my life had become, but the darkness wouldn't let me. As I packed my bags ready to flee, the shadows seemed to close in around me, suffocating me, reminding me that there was no escape. I was trapped, bound by the deal I had made, by the darkness I had embraced. And so I stayed, living in fear, waiting for the day when the darkness would finally consume me. I knew it was only a matter of time. And then one day I woke up to find that the whispers had stopped. The house was silent, unnaturally so, as if the darkness itself was holding its breath. I knew that something was about to happen, something terrible. And then he appeared, my son, standing in the doorway, his eyes cold and emotionless. He looked at me and smiled, a smile that sent a shiver down my spine. And for the first time in years, he spoke. "Mommy," he said in a voice that was too calm, too collected, "you're going to join Daddy soon, aren't you?" My heart stopped. I stared at him, my breath caught in my throat. "What did you say?" I whispered, hoping I had misheard. "You heard me, Mommy," he said, his smile widening. "You and Daddy will be together soon. He's waiting for you." I hurriedly got off the bed, scrambling away from him, my body trembling with fear. I couldn't take it anymore. I knew what I had to do, but the thought of it made me sick. How could I kill my own child? But this wasn't the child I bargained for. He was a monster, a demon that I had unleashed into the world. I grabbed a knife from the kitchen and returned to the room, my hands shaking. The boy was still there, standing in the doorway, watching me with those cold, unblinking eyes. "You can't do it," he said, his voice taunting, mocking. "You don't have the courage." Tears streamed down my face as I raised the knife, my hands trembling uncontrollably. But he was right. I couldn't do it. I dropped the knife, collapsing to the floor in a heap, sobbing uncontrollably. I was too weak, too broken. I had damned us both. The boy walked over to me, patting my head as if I were a child. "Don't worry, Mommy," he said soothingly. "It's better this way. Soon it will all be over." The next day, I left the house and never returned. I couldn't bear to stay in that place any longer, with that thing that was not my child. I walked away from everything, from the life I had once known, from the love I had lost, from the darkness that had consumed me. But even as I walked away, I knew I couldn't escape what I had done. The boy, the demon, I had unleashed it into the world, and there was no undoing that. I had made my deal with the darkness, and now I would have to live with the consequences. It's been 6 months now since I left the house. I don't know where the boy is now. I don't know what he's doing, what horrors he's unleashing on others, but I know one thing. I can never go back. I can never face the thing that I created, the monster that was born out of my desperation and fear. And so I wander, a broken shell of a woman, haunted by the memories of what I did, by the knowledge that I brought a demon into this world and Tifint. There is no redemption for me, no salvation, only the endless torment of knowing that I am the cause of all the suffering that has followed. And there within the darkness I could hear my husband's voice. The whispers continued, growing louder, more insistent, until they were all that remained. All I hear every day is my husband's voice, in a tormenting whisper, still asking me, "Whose child is this?" This question daily echoes through the empty halls of my dark and hollow soul, unanswered. I was encumbered by the problems of childlessness. I was desperate for a baby at all cost. I sought solutions from darkness for the blessing I longed for. Yes, I got my solution, but it wasn't what I bargained for. I never knew what I was getting was tainted with darkness. I got a curse instead of a blessing. I got an evil instead of a baby. Now I live with regrets. I have made my bed, and now I must lie in it. The price for my desperation, for my betrayal, is eternal torment, and as I sit here, I know that the end of the end will soon come, and I'll join my husband in whatever lies beyond. But even then, I know I will never find peace. Follow this page or subscribe to this channel for more stories.